Hello and welcome to the Fellowship Phase, an Adventures in Middle-earth podcast. I'm Josh and that's Callum. We're going to give you inside information on how to find your own path through Tolkien's world.
War must be. While we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all. But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness. Nor the warrior for his glory.
Hello, Callum.
Hello, Josh. Hello. No, it's just Josh, I guess.
Just Josh, and hello, listeners. First off, excellent quote to kick off. For listeners to understand, Callum doesn't tell me in advance what these quotes are, and it's lovely to get a good flavour into the episode. And I know this quote very well because Faramir says this, and it's a bit of a note that I had written down on Helmer's character sheet because I think it summed up a lot of his attitude towards the fact that war and violence was important but not good, and it gave his perspective on the world. And Tolkien captured it well with Faramir. So, a top quote to kick off our episode about combat.
I think it is a great quote for a couple of reasons for this episode, in which we are planning to talk about our experience of running or playing in combat in Adventures in Middle-earth and role-playing games in general, and how to make that. I want to use the word efficient, but I guess the other way of looking at it is fun, because the reason why I want it to be efficient, or at least what I'm doing as lore master, is so that I get more time for the players to do their thing and for it to be fun. Like, the purpose of the efficiency is for there to be more fun for the players.
Yes,
is what I think. But I think this quote is good because it tells you a little bit about Tolkien's thoughts. Like, I think it comes across like it's not a game. It's not like D&D where combat is fun or desirable. Like, combat should be tense and horrible and something you want to avoid at all costs. Whereas I think the traditional D&D trope is you get combat because you want experience. And I'm not sure that's ever really left the game, even though that's not how it really works so much now.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I think slaying of monsters and fighting of bad guys is a kind of core part of D&D, at least in the kind of D&D culture it is. It certainly doesn't match with Tolkien, though, because Tolkien's heroes, while some of them are mighty warriors, are not glorious for their battles or for their violence. Often they're glorious in spite of that.
Yeah.
Or they're very reluctant, not reluctant heroes, but very reluctant warriors who are pushed into doing something because of duty or love or desperation, rather than who seek out combat, which actually makes creating characters and adventurers interesting, because seeking out of battle and adventure and fighting is not really a motivation that works with Adventures in Middle-earth at all. So I think it's interesting how we tackle combat. It is mechanically very similar to vanilla 5th edition, but with some kind of twists. And I think talking about the word efficiency is good. I think as a player, what I'm thinking of as efficiency is more time for the kind of the fun and the role playing and the playing with our characters, and less time for what is effectively a lot of administration that needs to be done during combat.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think in terms of it, because it's in Middle-earth, the whole ethos is different. I guess the most important thing for me to make combat fun is to have a very clear purpose, because you're never going to be like, a cave, we should go in and kill some goblins or orcs. It's just not that world. Like, it's almost always going to be there's some mission that you're trying to complete, and that needs to be the focus. So it's defending the town, or saving the person that's been captured, or escaping, or chasing down. These purposes come out. And I think that when you first start running Adventures in Middle-earth, you can, and I certainly found this, I think you can be drawn into the idea that like every adventure needs to have a big combat. And actually what I've learned is that you really don't need that. Like actually the journey in itself is enough, and discovery, and the combat is one tool. But if we're sorry, I'm not going to do a podcast episode on why I shouldn't run the combat, because combat's really fun as well, isn't it? It's a moments for people to be heroic, and it leads to failure, and failure is so much fun.
Yes, this discussion went in a direction I wasn't expecting.
Yeah,
but I think it's relevant context. It made me think of the fact that, like in The Hobbit, which obviously is Tolkien's starting point, one of the motivations for the adventure is to slay the dragon, but it is seen throughout the entire book by some of the protagonists and also all the characters they meet as quite a foolhardy adventure to go and slay the dragon. In the end, they don't. Spoilers if you haven't read The Hobbit. And Bard does. And Bard only does it out of a kind of desperation to protect his town. And then the massive battle at the end is done off camera because Bilbo is knocked unconscious. So even that is an inglorious way of, we're not getting focused on this.
And then they made a whole film about it.
Yeah, I've got thoughts about that. I think by way of entering into this episode, though, I think the point is that combat is not just this kind of grind. It's not something you do in a video game. It's not just violence for the sake of violence in a kind of role-playing sense. It likely has a purpose. There's probably less of it than in some other role-playing games. And when there is combat, it should feel significant. And anything we can do to make the rules very smooth so that the role-playing and the characters can lead in combat, I think is important. We go right back to the beginning. The first combat that you ran, which was the first combat most people had played in, was a very straightforward protagonists, bandits. Can you remember what it was like suddenly going from a bit of role play into we're rolling some dice, there are mechanics?
Yeah, that was 5 years ago, so a little bit struggling to remember it. But I think my memory at the time was that the mechanics of it felt overwhelming. It just seemed like a lot of stuff to keep track of. Like I had to figure out what order people went in. I had to read the rules about what they did, and then I roll a dice for them, and I roll another dice for the damage, and then I had to read what that effect was, and also I had to make decisions in their characters about what they would do, and I wanted them to make good decisions, but also they weren't clever people, so then it was like they probably wouldn't make the optimal decisions. So how do you decide what they would do in character? Like you're almost role-playing in the NPC.
Yeah.
Like how would they act? I also felt a little bit jarring because you've been talking and then suddenly it's like you go from this quite free-form, open discussion where people are quite relaxed to suddenly it's like quite rigid and rule-based and 6-second intervals. It becomes very controlled, and that I think is quite a different style of running the game. And I found all those things, like I do remember the first time running it, that was much more difficult than the combat that I ran a couple of weeks ago at the end of our campaign, which was like, I don't know how many NPCs, like 30 NPCs, many of them named with complex rules. That was really straightforward. So I guess my point there is that like when you first start out, it will be really hard and then you'll do it more and it'll get easier.
And do you think that part of that is that when you first start out, you have, whether someone's taught you or you've read the books, you have a lot of rules, but it's hard to know what matters and what doesn't in combat. And certainly something I felt is actually knowing what the NPCs or the monsters would do in a kind of their character would do is so valuable for players' enjoyment. Whereas actually things like the amount of damage they do, it clearly is mechanically important that there is a number and that it comes from somewhere. But actually, sometimes using, for instance, average damage, which is an option, as a way of kind of speeding things along, is so much better when you can then focus on actually what's this bandit going to do that's going to make the players think in the moment what's going on.
Yeah, they have to feel like there's some sort of challenge, and they have to feel worried that something bad's going to happen to their character. It doesn't necessarily need to be damage anyway, but yeah, we've used average damage, which is essentially instead of them like rolling a damage dice and adding a modifier, you can just work out what the sort of average damage they would do based on that, and then you just apply that every time they hit. And yeah, at the beginning, I found it like you roll for attack for each individual person, you apply a modifier, decide if they hit or not, and then you roll the damage dice, you add the modifier, and you tell the player that. That's quite lengthy. There was the Battle of Siege of Stonyford, where I think I first used the average damage, and essentially what I managed to condense that down to was I had a note of everybody's AC, so I knew if I was going to hit or not. I set it up on Roll20, which is the platform that we use to auto roll. And then I literally, all I had to do was press a button, and I instantly knew if it hit, and I knew what damage it was. But I think I just set it up as set damage. So I don't even almost need to look at the damage, because you're just like, Goblin versus Halmir. Press it up to 19. That hits. No his armor class. 5 points of damage to you. Next. I took it from being 30 seconds to 2 or 3 seconds. And when you're running 20 goblins, that might not feel like much of a time saving, but then it took that out. And then what I wasn't having to deal with the sort of cognitive load of the mechanics. Instead, what I was saying was like, well, these goblins are going to run over this wall. Like, these goblins are going to flank round. These goblins are going. So I could start thinking in more what the tactics would be to make them feel like they actually were making sensible decisions. One thing that I know one of us is going to mention, so I'm going to say it first so I can steal your thunder, is that there's a really excellent book that I think you recommended for me. I think that's the case, which is The Monsters Know What They're Doing. Oh, he's got it on his phone. Did I steal your thunder then?
It was literally going to be the next thing I mentioned.
Yeah, I was just filibustering you. Yeah.
You filibustering me so that you could get into this. The Monsters Know What They're Doing. Series of books by Keith Amman.
Fantastic. I used that like recently I was running D&D, and I was running a Rakshasa, which is a sort of like shape-shifting tiger devil sort of person. And that was really useful for that, just to get an idea of how different enemies would. And there isn't that book for AIM, which I wish there was. I wish also there was more monsters to use, better range in the source books. Maybe we'll get that eventually. But I think trying to get that insight into how they would run and worrying less about mechanics is probably the first bit of advice.
I think so. I think something I often think about is underneath a lot of the way that we play are numbers and mechanics and rules. And they're important because there needs to be a degree of kind of certainty in a group of what's going to happen. There should be a cause and effect so you can understand how the world works. But if you focus too much on the dice, just the dice, really combat boils down to just here is one column of numbers, here's another column of numbers, and there is an element of chance. It's not the most stimulating. It's the story that's layered on top of that that's important. And I think when a lore master focuses on the role play of the villains, their actions, how they might surprise the characters in combat, maybe not how they surprise them, how they might do exactly what the characters are expecting and predicting in combat, is more valuable than actually having all of the gritty numbers as the thing that you spend all your time on.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing that I've settled on. When in Adventures of Middle-earth Lore Master's book, there's a section on attributes for the enemy. I remember reading that and at the time being like, well, it's loads of options. But quite often it would boil down to, if they do this, then roll an extra damage die. And it basically would just add numbers in a certain effect. So if this enemy gets a critical hit, then they get extra damage. And, I could incorporate that into the stat block. I never find those sort of abilities that interesting. If someone rolls a critical hit is already terrifying for the players. Adding extra damage on to an enemy's attack, it's, oh no, they did 20 rather than 12 points of damage. 20 points of damage is scary no matter what level you're at. That's a lot of damage. And I'm not saying that the numbers aren't important, but I think that when people seem most worried in combat is when I do something or the enemies do something that they weren't expecting. You remember, like, in combats that we've had recently in AIM, that like things that have happened that have made you worried as a player character that wasn't just lots of damage?
Yes. The combat we most recently ran in AIM was the culmination of the whole campaign. It was the confrontation with the big villain, with Volter at his fortress, all these different NPCs. I think what the challenge there was that it was not simply, a flat battlefield with some enemies and some players. It was a complex and dynamic setting. There was a fortress. We were outside it. We had multiple objectives. We had to get in. We were looking to recover some equipment. We were looking to defeat the villain. We were looking to save some people. There were a lot of moving parts. The things that were scary were not that some of the NPCs could deal mega damage, which they did. It was, we're constantly being forced to make choices. Do I stay close to one of my fellow characters to help support them, but potentially sacrifice achieving this objective? Or do I go to the objective, but leave this wounded ally here? That's where I felt where the stress and the drama came in, is presenting the players with choices, and not choices that they can use maths to calculate the best decision. I think when the game is running and people are thinking, okay, if my probability of success is blah, and if I hit, the average damage I will deal is blah, therefore the optimal thing to do is to fight villain A rather than villain B. That might suit people's playstyle, and no criticism if that's what you enjoy. That's not what I enjoy. I want it to be that I'm making a decision in combat because I think it's what the character's doing. I think it's dramatic. So I think the numbers should facilitate the story, not the other way around. And combat's most exciting and challenging when there are decisions to be made rather than dice to be rolled.
And I think what's important is so that people can't, because what I found rolling, like using tokens and stuff, is that if you use a preset token, people quite quickly get to recognizing that. So say I'm using a goblin token, people will be like, a goblin, it has these abilities and these attributes because they've seen the stat block before, and they kind of know what to expect, which, is slightly metagaming, but also their characters will have an understanding of what a goblin is in that world. So what I tend to try to do as I went on was like use different tokens or subvert people's expectations. Like use a token, but actually this goblin's got a special ability. Oh, this goblin seems stronger than usual, or something more interesting than that. And their weapon is dipped in some sort of green, making sure that people don't have the decisions all made because they don't know exactly what they're dealing with. And then also having specific characters can make it tricky. But I feel like as I went on, if I was adding in mechanics to make an NPC enemy more complex, it really had to be worth it. And so, like in the most recent combat, I tried to establish, like, this guy's really tall, he looks really big, and that guy was a grappler. So I gave him some, like, grappling feats. So he was really good at grappling, and I used that opportunity to try and drag Stuart's character into fire.
Yeah.
And I knew in my head, I was like, I'm not really going to do that much damage with this, and it's not going to win the combat. But I think it's going to be scary because basically what I'm presenting to is like this player character has been put into a situation which is not advantageous to them, and it's subverting the action economy. So I think rather than adding abilities which are just more damage, it's ones that like either impact the player's ability to impact the objectives, as you spoke about, or cancel their abilities, like subvert expectations and make things a bit more uncertain. That's what's scary, isn't it? The not unknown.
Yes.
So I guess trying to make the combat unknowable.
I think so. All the numbers that we use in role-playing games are approximations anyway, because they're just an imperfect way of simplifying very complicated things. So the fact that a character has 6 ability scores is a pretty good way of allowing us to use rules to add chance into things, but it doesn't sum up a character. Just in the same way that rolling a dice to hit does not accurately reflect the complexity of a dynamic battle.
Yeah.
So the dice and the numbers are important to allow the game to kind of function and to keep that level of chance and success and failure. But becoming fixated on the numbers means you end up playing a numbers game, which I don't think is what people who participate in RPGs do, because there are actually games, much more structured board games, tabletop games, where playing a slightly more chess-like game where you can math out the answer to the problem is encouraged. And I don't think that's what tabletop role-playing games are. Certainly isn't for me. That scene where the villain was dragging Runin, I felt that Helme was one of the people who was deciding whether to go and help Runin at the expense of making an attack. Now, if I had taken myself out of my character space there and thought about it, I would have been like, well, actually, Helm is very good with his sword. He's very likely to hit a low-level enemy and likely deal a lot of damage, and he's got 2 attacks. But so I do that, or do I use my action just to pull Runin out of the fire? Which again, I probably could have thought, how much damage is fire going to do in one turn? How much health does Runin have? Looking just at the numbers, the rational thing for me to do would have been Helmir to just hit henchman number 4. That didn't make any sense for the character. He wasn't standing in combat being like, I think I can hurt this henchman faster than Runin will be on fire. He rushed over to help, and it felt like a challenge in the moment that you presented us, and I didn't have any hesitation embracing what was mathematically not optimal because it was in character the right thing to do.
Yeah. I was thinking about that combat the other day because I thought it ran very well. Like, I think we played at combat for 3 or 4 sessions. I think someone wrote down how many rounds it went for as well. Stuart wrote it down.
It's like dozens of rounds.
Like
I feel,
rounds.
yeah, it was
a lot. It was a lot, and there was like 5 player characters and lots of different people running. And I was trying to think, what did I do there that worked so well compared to, like, I remember a combat that you had at somewhere called Framsburg, which is like a place, like the historic place that the people Rohan come to, the Eothed come from. And we've talked about that before. And I remember at the time thinking that was like that combat dragged on a bit. It was quite complex and like fun, but like just less efficient than what I did now. And it was what we talked about already, is simplifying stat blocks using, I guess, experience. But the other thing I was thinking about that made it, although it was so long, fun, and I don't know what you think about this, and actually I was thinking about this the time that you ran a Beholder for a Monster Hunter mission.
Yes.
And we ran in, and basically you wanted to have like your moment to play the villain and do them, and he was a really cool character. And we were like, nope, and just like started combat and killed him. And we all felt bad because you obviously didn't get to do the thing you wanted to do. And ever since that, I've been like, I don't want that to happen. And one thing I've employed a lot is like, whenever you've got like a really cool villain that you want to play, just give them a legendary action called monologue.
Yeah,
that's what I do. I just use a legendary action. And what I prepped for that combat more than anything, because I had the NPCs and the map, and I had like ideas about mechanics, and set up some traps against you because you love setting up traps against my characters. So I was setting up traps against you, and had this like wacky goblin who was doing all these sort of weird traps. And I had different phases to the battles. I had all the kind of complex battle stuff that's quite standard. But the main thing that I think was effective, I don't know how you feel this was, I actually prepped insults and lines. I prepped the role play because when I'm in the moment of running the game, I have any headspace to think, oh, witty comeback.
Yes.
It's impossible. Whereas instead, I think I came up with some pretty good insults, and you guys are all like, what?
No, you did, and they made different characters very angry and frustrated in a way that I think was very fitting for the scenario. Volta, part of his kind of ability was this serpent tongue and being able to sway people with his charisma and his words. And I actually thought it was a pretty good weapon, because really what he was doing was he was trying to rile people up so that they would make bad decisions. They would get angry. They might try and charge in to attack him when he'd all these traps set. And I think you spent your time prepping those insults because they were really good. They were personalized to the individual characters. It kept us in the moment. I had a very similar thing when I ran Strat, who the whole module is basically designed around one villain and his character. The whole point of the module is to explore his character and the players, and then eventually they likely fight him. I wanted him, because he's this strategic genius, he's charismatic, he's an ancient vampire. He had a lot of witty things to say to you, and I prepped those in advance as well, because I knew that there'd be a lot of rules that I was handling in a combat, because he was very complicated. And I knew that he as a character would be saying exciting, powerful things, and I knew in the moment I would probably struggle to be as charismatic as he was. But it was time well spent, I think, because again, it added flavor to the combat, and I felt good when I was able to, deploy something or ad lib something that I had written before. And again, I think a lot of people who play role-playing games have limited prep time, and there's a lot of prep that can be done. We talk about kind of efficiency of prep and efficiency of combat. I think how you prep the combat is part of that efficiency, and if you spend time thinking about or preparing some of the role play character elements of the villains, I think that's time well spent.
I think it's better spent than non-mechanics.
Yes.
Like, you come up with a really elegant system of maths for rolling damage, but I don't think your player characters really notice if you're doing 7, 8, 9, like there's the variation of numbers. What they will notice is when someone says to them, the depth of your understanding makes the shallowest brook seem like an ocean, which I particularly enjoy doing. And actually, if you've got limited prep, I went to an AI generator and I just gave it the prompt, which was something along the lines of, you're in Tolkien's world, can you create some insults based on this and this? So I like experimented with that to kind of help me come up with some ideas. Like, I gave it the style of language I wanted and then got it to roll with. Because, yeah, I think in terms of making a combat efficient, you just need to understand the rules and the mechanisms as best you can. I guess, is there anything else? We've talked there about like simplifying the sort of admin and then making sure that the role-playing aspects are prep them as much as you can, and also interesting mechanics. So not just add more damage, but alternate things like grappling or a giant bat coming down and carrying the player character off, which was hilarious for me and terrifying, I think, for that player.
It was, and again, it's because you presented a different challenge that could not just be solved by AC and damage dice, because we could have killed that bat, but in doing so, also killed one of our friends. So you presented a fresh challenge. I had a couple of quick thoughts I wanted to run through about things that we've done to make things more efficient and run more smoothly, and some that I know other people use that we didn't use, and whether we could use them. So first one, using a grid or not using a grid. So predominantly we used a grid in Roll20, but actually I think as you became more experienced, sometimes you went to Theatre of the Mind for smaller combats that were perhaps less consequential, but still there was still some element of success or failure. I'm thinking about when we were in Gundabad, which was effectively a 10-session dungeon crawl. Sometimes when we encountered a small patrol, you didn't put us on the map. You were like, we'll use this Theatre of the Mind, we'll try and keep it dynamic, keep the pace going, and actually if the result seems obvious, we'll maybe move forward. How did you feel about balancing grid and Theatre of the Mind?
Yes. I find it frustrating sometimes, like, here's a weird example. So Pokemon games on the Game Boy, right? And you're like gone through the game and you're like really high level, and for some reason you go back to an early area and you're going through the grass, and then another Rattata comes up and you're like, oh, obviously I'll defeat this. Like, why is the game doing this to me?
Yep.
And I think sometimes that can be the case in higher levels in AIM, but more so in D&D. But by the point you were in Gundabad, 1 or 2 orcs on a patrol aren't really going to challenge you that much, other than the sort of potential for detection. So I guess I abstracted those combats because I felt like they were inconsequential. Like, it really just mattered, could you catch up with them? And that could all be done Theatre of the Mind. I think there's pros and cons. Some people are more comfortable with Theatre of the Mind, and I think some people really don't like it. And so I was always mindful that I want everyone to have fun. So I tried to avoid doing Theatre of the Mind mostly, because I think if you are like, it can end up feeling like we talked about this in the chase rules episode, like you want things to seem fair to the players.
Yes.
And it's harder to, if it's on a grid, then I think it's easier for the players to keep track of what you're doing. And it helps me as well, because it's I have to hold less in my head. So Theatre of the Mind, I think, is fine for like very small combats, not much going on, you're expecting it to not last very long. Anything larger than that, I just found the grid and a map help, because then it's all written down, and you guys are like, we talk about a council of DM because everyone playing's DM'd. So then I can be a bit more relaxed, because I know that if I get something wrong, someone will point it out.
Yeah.
Which I thought might be annoying, but it's not, because I just changed my mindset. I was like, I can just not worry about the rules so much. And then if I don't know something, I just ask you guys. So that's good.
The game alongside Strad that I probably DM the most is Alien, which I think has a very effective combat system in a very different way, which is to capture the sense of the violence of the Alien films, which is very violent, very physical, but very fast. You don't really see long, protracted, pitched battles between the characters and the aliens. It's a sudden, terrifying moment of violence.
The very first game we played of Alien, we got on 2 corridors, and I was playing an android that everyone hated, but I was a lovely guy. And literally the alien turned up, dragged me down a corridor, and just destroyed my head.
Yeah. I remember that.
It was like such a shock. And I'd be like, yeah. Oh.
I've seen people run Alien on a grid online, which maybe suits their games. I really dislike it because it slows it all down, and I think it slightly gives the players confidence, or at least they feel slightly on sure footing when there's a grid, and they can almost pause, and it becomes more turn-based. It's always turn-based, and it's always imaginary. But by doing it theatre of the mind, and in Alien, rather than a grid, they use sort of zones, which are, again, quite abstract, kind of like short, medium, long.
Yeah, that works really well. In the One Ring, the combat there is much more abstracted. So actually, maybe what we're convincing yourself is that we should be playing the One Ring instead of AIM, but too late for that.
It allows the combat to be faster, and I think there's an element of kind of buy-in from the players that combat in Alien is not really about them winning. A lot of it is about the kind of the fear and the consequences and the drama of it. But it's a very efficient combat. You could do like a dramatic combat could take 5 or 10 minutes, which if you used 5th edition rules, might take you like an hour to deal with a monster of that size. So it's certainly possible to make combat more streamlined, but without taking away the kind of joy of it. So I think grid, yes or no, is an interesting one. One thing that I think is interesting is about whether or not you tell the players some of the numbers to speed things along. So, for instance, with AC, that's typically a kind of gated, only the DM knows the AC of a monster, at least at first. Some people I know just say pretty much straight out, this orc has an AC of 15. And then when people roll the dice, there doesn't need to be I've rolled a 15, yes, that hits, blah, blah, back and forth. How would you feel about the numbers being more obvious to speed things along?
I think I don't like the idea of saying it up front because I think it ruins some of the immersion. But what I tend to do is that, say you're attacking the same group of enemies over several rounds, I will say that just hits. So I don't directly say the AC is 15. But if you roll a 15, I'm like, that just hits. I'm essentially saying to you what the AC is, but without really coming out of, I don't know, it feels slightly different to say like the AC is 15 to over a couple of rounds of combat when it's obvious to the players what the AC is. If they've been paying attention, they should know because a 14 missed last round and a 15 hit this round. So they know that. So I'm almost like signposting that to everybody just in case somebody hadn't caught it. That is the AC. So I find myself doing that, and then I guess that speeds it up. Yeah, I don't think you want to give them the mechanics too much, but there's like ways of saying it that won't ruin the immersion, but you are telling them. So, your attack doesn't seem to be very effective. Or you're telling the player that they've got resistance. So you're giving them information. It's about what their character would know. Yeah. One other thing I was thinking about, are you finished on that point, or you want to? No. So I guess I was just thinking about there in terms of efficiency. There's ways that you can, as a DM, make your NPCs more efficient and get through that as quickly as possible. And there's a way to try and help your players be efficient, because whilst it's a bit boring to sit and watch the DM run through 100 monsters, it's also not great if one of the player characters is taking ages and ages on the turn. So one thought for both, I guess, is initiative tracking. So in bigger combats, I tend to try and simplify initiative. And by that, I mean, like, if I've got 5 different enemy types, I'll try and make sure that they're all going together or they're all in the same initiative count. Because then it's just me. There's not less of that, like, exchanging the momentum. So I just do all the NPCs together as much as possible. I don't think it really matters. And then the other thing is, and this is for both players and the DM, is I think it's a very different way of running the game. When you're in a role play setting, I basically just try as much as possible to shut up and listen and not really, like, I will describe things and talk to you, but I think, I'm not sure this is true, but I think that you guys do most of the talking. And if maybe my main role is to like bring out some of the quieter players or to answer questions in description. Whereas in combat, I very much try and run it like really, like you're doing like a really firm agenda setting. It's like chairing a meeting in a very different way. What's the next action, right? Is your go, you're coming up next. This is happening, like keeping people focused and just trying to drive it along. Because I want the combat to feel pressurized and quick. Like it's 6 seconds. You don't have time. So not stressing people out too much by being like, you're taking too long. But at the same time being like, prompting them and driving people a little bit, which can, I think, be a bit stressful, but that's fine.
It can be, but in a good way.
Or
I would agree that I think in the role play sense, we do most of the talking. And I think that's a good thing, because I think that's what you want the players to be telling the story and driving things forward, and the lore master to be there to serve as the canvas in the world and to help if answer any questions or play the NPCs if they need to, but really let the players be playing the game. And I agree that flips on head in combat, because you need to keep moving forward with that. And that the word agenda setting is good there, because bad combat can end up like bad work meetings. And I think everyone's been in a bad work meeting where everyone's talking across each other, or we've lost focus of what we were supposed to be doing, and it's infuriating for everyone, and people all lose interest in what's going on. And the worst possible thing to happen in a role-playing game, particularly in a combat, is that the players become disinterested and they're looking at their phones, or they're reading the rule book, or what reading the rule book, they're just perusing through the rule book rather than listening to what you're narrating or what their fellow player is narrating. And I think often that happens when it gets bogged down in the grit of numbers and of, oh, I need to check this mechanic and how it interacts with that mechanic, and rather than
delegate that. Just has been like, there's a rule mechanic comes up. This is I do a lot. So shout out to James. I think James probably has one of the best grasps of the rules in our game. So if anything like that happens in combat or in the game, I tend to try and just say, okay, so and so, whoever's not doing something, go and look that up, and we'll come back to it. And they're engaged because they're getting to look up rules, which is fun, I think. And everyone else is engaged. And the other aspect, which you reminded me of there, is in terms of the role-playing aspect, is I think it's your job as a DM to make it exciting. So a player says, I roll an 18 to hit, and I hit them with my sword. Like, I think it's great to try and encourage players to be like, how do you do that? So when we always used to like, how do you want to do this? And Matt Mercer says when they kill the big bad or something. But embellishing, it's been like, okay, so, Halmir has taken a sword and he's slashed fiercely across 2 orcs, and he's rushed in next to Runin and holding his shield up, and he's ready. Runin, what are you doing? And it's like bringing the narrative in. So like summarizing what they've just done and then trying to bring it back to them, or using that opportunity, like Runin, that there is an orc behind you and there's 2 more rushing on ahead, but in the distance you can see that the captors are getting away.
Yes. Constantly reminding them of the stakes is good. Is to keep them on target, as it were.
That's kind of a lot to do whilst balancing the mechanics. But if you get the mechanics done or make them simple, then it frees you to do that. And then that's when combat, I think, becomes engaging.
On the getting bogged down in the rules, and this is a piece of advice that often comes up for new DMs, and it's something that's very hard to do, but I think something we've got better at over time, and it helps that we all run games. If you don't know a rule, it is always better to just decide something and continue playing than losing the momentum and spending a long time looking it up. By all means, turn to someone, hopefully James is there, to get a quick bit of information on ruling. But if actually, maybe there is not a rule that covers this, maybe it's a novel thing that's come up, or maybe there is actually a bit of a conflict and there's not a clear answer, it is always better for the lore master to say, this is what I'm proposing we're going to do in this situation. Hopefully the group generally agrees, and then just keep playing. And then later on, look it up, check.
Yeah.
If there's an answer, you can tell everyone what the answer is. But try and stay in the game and not in the rules.
And when you play players the same group a lot, you can just make your own decisions. I think there's been quite a few things where we've just decided, like the chase rules, I think we just did. Like we quite often would be like, that rule doesn't make sense. We're going to do it like this. We just change how certain rules worked in our game, which isn't, I don't know if that's really homebrewing, but that collaborative rule setting, if you and the players agree that a rule doesn't make sense, just change the rule. Like, as long as it's fun for everybody. Yeah, so we've talked about a whole load of different combat ways to make combat efficient and fun.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we've not spoken about?
No, I don't think so.
Maybe we can circle back to the thing that we spoke about right at the beginning then, just to round this out. So I read that quote from what Faramir said about not loving the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for its glory. So we've talked a lot about like how to make combat efficient, but how do we make combat talking? Like how do we make that? What is it that, because I hope that I've managed to achieve that name. So what is it that has been different about that combat compared to our other role-playing games that's captured what Faramir says there? Or have we not captured it? I don't know.
I think we have, and I thought a lot about that line from Faramir, and I think it's about combat always being a difficult decision to enter into, or never the right thing to do, but it's. We'll need to edit out this massive pause because I'm not sure exactly what
feel high stakes. Is that the right term? Or?
Combat shouldn't be something that's sought out for the sake of it. It should only ever be something that happens because there is another challenge and another story beat that we're looking to achieve. I don't think the party ever just set out to fight someone else. Those decisions come up, and often there should be a decision about whether or not they actually participate in a combat at all. You always did a good job, I think, of there being alternatives, that maybe there was an opportunity to sneak past or to avoid or to diffuse the situation or to try something else. I think putting the ball in the player's court and saying it's quite a solemn, difficult thing to go into fighting and putting your life on the line, that's the decision you have to make, and it's a difficult decision. I think that's good.
And also, I think that comes about by it being challenging. So if you consistently don't make combat tough enough, and then players won't be scared of it. So they'll just be like, we can kill all these goblins, and then it becomes less consequential. And I think that the number of times I got you just to the brink of TPK without actually doing it, and the way that like with balancing combat is a whole different thing. But what my advice for that would be is like, don't be afraid of just having flexibility in your prep. Prep like all the things we talked about before, like their motivations, the type of enemies, etc. But really be flexible about how many. So I often find that there's more people arriving, or there's like waves of enemies, and I would have like on the side of the screen a load of tokens prepped, and I'd have some really hard, and I would just get an idea of how the combat was feeling to the players and how it was doing numbers wise, and then I would add or subtract the number of people that were coming in. So it's not, I've not pre-decided that there's 20, and sometimes you knew exactly how many enemies there were because Runen had an annoying tracking ability that told them that, so I couldn't punch it in there. But most of the time it was possible to be like, there was actually 30 goblins rather than 20 because this combat is way too easy for you. So yeah, I think that's a key thing, is to try and find that challenge threshold that's good for the players to make it feel tense.
Yes, it's good to edit on the fly. I think is a perfectly valid thing to do. I think something we talked about way back on the pod, a piece of advice that Matt Colville had, which I always stuck with, which was things should be difficult for the players because of decisions they make not mistakes that the DM makes.
Yes, that's so
When
true.
you're prepping, you think, oh, I'll put in 20 goblins. And actually, it turns out that's way too many.
Yeah,
That's not fun for the player. That's just a mistake that has been made or a lesson to be learned. If they decide that they want to do something that's incredibly difficult and has consequences, that's great. That's role playing. But it's fine if you've made a mistake to amend that, because it should all be in service of players having fun.
it's totally arbitrary how many enemies there are.
Yeah.
And so I always found it much better to like under challenge initially with the expectation that I'm going to throw more challenge in. I also think that's scarier, that more people are arriving. Like whenever I quite often would have you guys roll a d6 on turn over 20, and then enemies would turn up, and you'd be like, oh, and I'd be like, but if they'd been there initially, it would be less scary. So yeah, I think that sort of balanced, being flexible with it can help bring the challenge point. Great. So we've had a kind of very inefficient conversation about how to make combat.
But hopefully it was a very fun conversation.
It was very fun for me, and hopefully for you, and hopefully for our dear listeners, which we've had a little flurry of emails, or rather, we hadn't checked the emails in some time and then found them all. But maybe we could give a bit of a shout out to some of the messages that we've had to end.
Yeah, let's do it, because we have had some lovely messages in and some quite thought-provoking ones about some of the stuff that we will be covering. So why don't we run through some of the people who've written in?
Yeah, so somebody called James wrote in to say that yes, Gondolin was one of the first stories that Tolkien wrote. So thank you to this mystery James. 5 months ago, Chris had emailed in to say that he appreciated the work that I've been doing and had been asking about AI for tasks like preparing a city, which I don't think I've done, which I think is a really good suggestion. We talked about preparing a city. So yeah, I think that's a good idea, using an AI to prompt some things in the city. He also noted that we often say in the podcast, we should do an episode on a sort of topic, and asked if we ever get to those, which I think is quite funny because I don't think we've written that down anywhere. So if anybody's listened, and please do email in if we've said we're going to do an episode on something and we haven't done it yet. Give us a little reminder.
Yeah. See, this just harkens back to what we said in this episode. Let your players, and what are the listeners if not the players? Let the players take on some of the cognitive load.
Danny got in touch with a welfare check because we hadn't posted an episode in a while. So we are alive and well. We've just been busy, but we're really happy to get back to recording. And he's also asked about incorporating spellcasting into our game, which is going to definitely be an upcoming episode, because we had planned to do that, but with his prompt, I think we need to get to that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to say on that, and there's definitely not a right answer, but there are loads of fun ways to do it. And I think it's worth like a really deep discussion. So we will definitely do that.
We'll bring in someone with more Tolkien knowledge to help us with the lore aspect. But I've certainly got ideas, and we did incorporate some spellcasting into our game. And yeah, I think it's tricky. Seth, I got in touch quite recently, actually, to ask if we're picking the podcast back up. Here's your answer. Yes, we are. And had some lists of topic suggestions, which are always really useful to receive. So talking about Lord of the Rings 5th edition versus AIM. So now we've wrapped up our current campaign, and there's a campaign wrap up to follow in the future on the pod. But I think we're going to try Lord of the Rings 5th edition. So I don't want to do episodes on comparing or reviewing it until we've really had a chance to play it. I'm going to put those in the tank. Some house rules, adventures in different time periods, and more adventure phases. So that was good to hear that people were liking that. And then finally, we had an email from Gelidor the Green, who is asking again about magic in Middle Earth. So actually, people are clamoring for magic in Lord of the Rings role playing. So we must answer.
Let's do it. So we're going to get a Tolkien scholar on. We're also going to need someone who's magical on if we're going to talk about magic in Tolkien. So who would we pick? Who's the ultimate wizard?
No emails except on party business. and comment suggestions and questions to thefellowshipphase@gmail.com. The long year turns to its close. Much we have accomplished these last seasons. Our fellowship disbands, but is not broken, and we will return.
On the next episode of The Fellowship Phase.